Hello YouTube, welcome to this channel again. Today we're gonna talk about an American serial killer, but not only, he is also a cannibal. So let's begin. Hope you like it.
Where's your emergency?
We often hear about cannibals, especially in movies, but in this story we will talk about a real one who came from the United States. Biography. Albert Hamilton Fish, aka Albert Fish, was born on May 1870 in Washington, D.C. and died on January 16, 1936 in New York State. His parents' names are Randall Fish and Ellen Fish. He is the youngest in his family and has three siblings, Walter, Annie, and Edwin Fish. He was a serial killer and cannibal. He even had a nickname as Brooklyn's Vampire, Mysterious Ogre, or Grey Man, Moon Maniac. All of these nicknames come from a story. His father was a riverboat captain, then in 1870 became a fertilizer manufacturer. He died of a heart attack in 1875 in Washington, D.C. His wife, Ellen, forced to find a job, was no longer able to care for Albert and placed him in an orphanage where he was frequently punished, whipped, beaten, and where, according to him, he discovered the pleasure of physical suffering. He then became a sadomasochist. I always wanted to inflict pain on others, and that others also make me suffer. All my life, I adored everything that hurt. Back at his mother's house, he often listens to his brother tell him stories about cannibals. At night, he ends up dreaming about these stories. He then starts to follow the crime columns in the newspapers. Fish did many sexual practices and committed many of his crimes to children. He was sentenced to death and executed in the electric chair. His crimes. In 1890, Albert Fish moved to New York, where he said he became a prostitute. It was at this time that he began raping young boys, a crime he continued to perpetrate after his marriage was arranged by his mother in 1898 with Anna. The couple had 6 children. She left him after 20 years of marriage and he remarried 3 times illegally. Around 1898, he worked at a house painter and says he continued to molest children under the age of 6. In 1903, he was arrested for embezzlement and incarcerated in Sing Sing prison. In January 1917, his wife left him for John Strauss. Following this rejection, Fish began self-mutilation. He introduced needles into his body. At the age of 55, Fish had delusions and hallucinations that God was ordering him to torture and castrate little boys. Doctors said he was suffering from religious psychosis. Grace Budd. On May 25, 1928, 18-year-old Edward Budd placed an ad in the Sunday edition of the New York World. 18-year-old male wishes to take up country position. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street. On May 28, 1928, responding to the young man's ad, Albert Fish, then 58 years old, visited the Budd at Manhattan. Albert Budd, the father, a baggage handler for the Equitable Life Insurance Society, and Delia Flanagan. He introduced himself as Frank Howard, a farmer from Farmingdale, New York, Long Island. He then meets the 12-year-old sister Grace of Edward Budd. Albert Fish promised to house and employ Edward for $15 a week, and in the meantime convinced the parents to let Chris accompany him to a birthday party that evening at her sister Annie Fish's house, giving them the address of the party, Columbus Avenue, near 137th Street. The parents did not know that the avenue did not go beyond 110th and that the address was wrong. Grace left with Fish the same day. She never returned. He took the girl with him to the train station. On the way, Fish stopped at a newsstand to pick up a package, and they both took the train to Irvington in Westchester County. At their destination, they went to Greenwood. There, Albert Fish had long since located a house called Wisteria Cottage in a secluded spot near a wood which had been abandoned for several years. His package contained his instruments of hell. In November 1934, when Grace's parents had already led the police to Albert Fish, he sent an anonymous letter to the victim's mother describing his motives and the origin of his taste for human flesh. His arrests. He was arrested 8 times between 1902 and 1933. The first for attempted fraud, another for theft from a store where he worked. For bounced checks, he received suspended sentences. Following his arrest in 1930, he was sent to Bellevue Mental Hospital for observation between 1930 and 1931. When the police searched his apartment, they found obscene letters, a cat with 9 tails, and a carrot and a frankfurter. The bot's letter, or rather, its envelope provided a lead. The letterhead had been crossed out incorrectly, and the policeman was able to decipher the address: 627 Lexington Avenue, where the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association resides. Unfortunately, none of the members of the association knew Frank Howard. The same police officer summoned all the members of the association. A young male volunteer janitor admits to stealing envelopes and letterheads from 622 Lexington Avenue. The policeman questioned the young man again. He moved. He remembered one detail: during the move, he left the envelopes on the shelf. When he examined the register of tenants, he noticed that the description matched that of Frank Howard, but he had signed under the name of Albert H. Fish. Unfortunately, he had just moved out of the apartment on November 11, the date Delia Budd received the letter. The police spokesman admits that Albert Fish was questioned several times about missing children, but that he was never really suspected. It was routine. He seemed so harmless. This man is not crazy, not dangerous to society on the face of it, even though he presents a psychopathic personality with a sexual nature. It is not known exactly how many victims he has to his credit. He himself admitted about 100 to investigators, although he has only been tried for 16 proven crimes. The investigating judge in charge of his case considered this number highly probable. His psychiatrist at the time, Dr. Frederick Wortham, believed that the number exceeded 400, which would make him the criminal with the most victims. His judgments. At his trial for the premeditated murder of Grace Budd in March 1935, Fish pleaded insanity and stated that he heard the voice of God telling him to kill children. He had done several acts and games involving masochism even with his children and grandchildren. The jury found him sane and guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. After his conviction, Fish confessed to lying about the murder of 8-year-old Francis McDonnell, who he killed on Staten Island. McDonnell was playing on the front porch of his home near Port Richmond on July 15, 1924. His mother saw an old man walking along, clenching and unclenching his fists. Later that day, the old man was seen again, but this time watching McDonnell and his friend play. The boy's body was found on the woods, near where the neighbor had noticed the old man taking the child earlier that afternoon. He had been assaulted, strangled with his suspenders. His last meal was roast chicken, which he was served boneless to avoid a suicide attempt. A few months earlier, he had slit his wrists with a T-bone steak. Fish arrived in March 1935 and was executed on January 15, 1936. His psychiatric history. Between 1930 and 1931, he was sent to the Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital for observation because of the reason of his arrests. The doctors who examined him declared that he was a sadomasochist. He indulged in self-mutilation and inserted needles into his body. And among his hobbies, he said he wanted to eat human flesh on full moon days. These tendencies were attributed to the abuse he received as a child. He also claimed that God gave him missions to kill. His killings often included a long torture before his victim was put to death. He would tie up children and whip them with a belt folded in half with nails split inside to tenderize the flesh for cooking. This story has left its marks on so many Americans that documentary films, books, music, and even video games have been inspired by it. What do you think about that story? Do you think fish really had psychiatric problems? Tell me your idea in the comments. So this is the end of the video. I hope you liked it and I'll see you next week for a new video. Goodbye.